All right, y'all. Welcome back to another week with yours truly, Dr. Pierre, your favorite board certified internist, host of Medicine Mondays, host of the Lunch Learn with Dr. Barry, and Real Physician Reacts. This week, I guess I'm a movie critic. This week, I'm talking about the series Painkiller on my right here, which is a Netflix series that highlights the opioid epidemic that we experienced. And of course, and let me just get that out the way. As a physician, obviously, I'm not a movie critic, so if you were here for an in-depth movie review, this really isn't it. But I do want to talk about it from the onus of a physician, a resident physician at that, who was coming in at the tail end where a lot of changes started occurring due to the opioid epidemic, right? And it was something that if you have older family members who may have experienced that time frame, it was an unfortunate sight to see. And this Netflix series, again, we'll just highlight again, this Netflix series really touched on some salient points. Now, those may be familiar with the Hulu version of this series, Dope Sick. Netflix obviously did their own because, competition is king these days. And it was interesting for several different reasons, and I'll touch base on that. First of all, let me just start off. Let me just start off saying I thought they did a great job. Of course, I think there were parts where maybe the embellishment was a little too much for me, but we'll like I said, we'll talk about that during this episode. But I thought it did a great job really kind of bringing those people who were there back during that time and giving them kind of a back seat or more of a backdoor view of what was happening during that time frame. So let me tell you, as a physician, especially resident physician, we dealt with the tail end where you started having lots of different rules and laws become enacted specifically to deal with this opioid epidemic. There was a term called pain pill mills that was frantic, where a doctor could set up shop and they would have line wrapped around the corner, people waiting to get a prescription for a pain medication, of course, paying cash to do so, and then go filling it at their local pharmacy. But when I tell you, while I was in residency, all of that came to a close. You started having things like local, state, and even national registries, to the point where now I can, even as we speak, I can search your name and date of birth, and I can tell you when's the last time you picked up a controlled prescription in like 10 different states right now. Like eventually I think it'll get to all 50. But right now, 10 different states, I can look and say, oh, you got a prescription from here. You paid cash for it. This is who wrote it. This is where you filled it at. Like, it is that severe, and it was because of the opioid epidemic that arrived, right? So I'm going to pretend. Let's pretend that you have no clue about an opioid epidemic. Let's pretend that you have like it's totally oblivious to what I'm talking about. Like, you're like, why would Netflix even do a series on opioid epidemic? What is the opioid epidemic? Especially those who may be thinking about obviously COVID pandemic and like, all right, like, could it have been that bad? The answer is yes. It, as bad as you can think the opioid epidemic was, it was worse. A lot of people will talk about kind of the crack era, right? The crack cocaine era and what that did to a lot of ravaged communities. The opioid epidemic was worse, right? In that sense, especially because of who it affected, and because of who it affected, it made policy changes and people really want to act different, right? I'll say it here now, right? When it was crack cocaine primarily affecting kind of the African American communities and minority communities, people are like, oh, okay, all right, that's something they got to deal with. But when the opioid epidemic hit, just like the meth issue that we were dealing with a few years ago, when the opioid epidemic hit and white America, middle white America, small town white America really started taking a beating, right? To say the least. All of a sudden, it was like, all right, something has to be done, and that's how significant this got here, right? So I do want to highlight, like I said, I'm not a movie critic. I'm not a movie critic, but I do want to highlight a few people who did a fabulous job. I'm even getting their names here just to make sure I get them. Matthew Broderick, Uzo Adoba, Taylor Kish, Dina Shababi, like those people. Wes Duchovny. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. Like I said, this is not a movie critique, and I am not a movie critic, but I think they did a fabulous job. So I wanted to make sure I highlighted, them, right? Because they did an absolute job doing it. And the way this series is set up, or it's about 6 episodes. The way this series is set up is that they start with a family in the beginning who gives the typical disclaimer that you typically will see in these types of movies, like, hey, you know what, this is a drama, this is satire, some of these things have been embellished, but then they stop and then they say, but unfortunately, my family member isn't made up. My family member passed away, died from an opioid epidemic, from the opioid abuse, right? From opioid dependence, right? Like, so I love how they flipped it and say, yeah, normally they give you the disclaimer to say, hey, yep, the things in here aren't all 100% true. But to have a family member get on there and say, I lost my daughter, I lost my son, I lost my husband, I lost my wife due to these opioid epidemic, and then they go into the story, I thought was very powerful at that point. And the way the story is kind of drawn out, one, they kind of follow the lives of, the drug reps, right? Which again is an interesting angle. And again, I didn't watch Dope Sick, so, and that's something I'll probably watch next. In fact, let me know in the comments if you think, hey, Dr. Barry Pierre, you need to go watch Dope Sick as well and give your feedback on Dope Sick. I will, right? Because it's all, once it's medically related, I'm in there talking about it. As well as the pharmaceutical like giants, right? Purdue Pharma, and more importantly, the Sackler family, right? So you follow like their storylines kind of throughout the process. And as a physician, I'll be honest, I would have loved to see a little bit more in depth this portion on the physicians aspect of it, because obviously when you got a pharmaceutical company, when you got the drug reps, but the person still has to sign that on the pen, right? It still took a doctor's signature to put that medication in someone's hand. And I would have loved to see a story arc associated with what the physicians were going through to that time, because they kind of highlighted it, right? And again, like I said, we're not gonna do any spoil, because especially if you have not watched it yet, I don't want to drop any like major spoils on you. But unfortunately, the story's been available, so it's not like something isn't public knowledge. But just in case you were planning on watching this series, go watch the series. I suggest you do. But again, like I said, I'll probably watch the other one as well too. That's on Hulu, just to get an idea of where we're going to back and forth. But they go through Richard Sackler, who was the CEO of Purdue Pharma. They go through a few drug reps so they can kind of see that progression here, and then they follow a couple families as well, particularly this one family, and how their father got started on opioid. It was just a work accident, and from that work accident, next thing you know, a very troubled story, which ends in a way, like I said, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's something you need to watch. Unfortunate way it kind of ended, for the person in the family. So it was very interesting to kind of see it kind of trace their lives, right? You see things like the obvious aspect of capitalism. You see the obvious aspect of greed. You see the obvious aspect of dependence. And I take care of patients now who can have a major surgery and will refuse to have any type of opioid pain medications. So think about that. Something that happened decades ago affects patients today and will affect patients from here on out, because I'm especially the older patients, they remember exactly what it was like. They remember exactly what it was like when the opioid epidemic was at its peak. They remember exactly. They probably had friends or family members likely affected. I tell people all the time, when we talk about COVID, there's always going to be someone who is either directly or indirectly affected by COVID for the rest of our lives. That's not changing. And I think for the opioid epidemic, the same thing has occurred, where there's always going to be someone who just remembers and it almost triggers them to the point now where I can't even suggest certain pain medications because my patients want nothing to do with it. So imagine and they're in pain. So it's not like they're not in pain. They're in pain, but because of that fear of being an addict, doc, I don't want to be an addict. Like that's what they say, doc, I don't want to be an addict. I'm not gonna take that pain medication. And because of that, they were like, I'll take everything else. I'll take Advil, I'll take Tylenol, I'll take lidocaine patches. I'll take everything else, but I'm not. And I don't care what type of surgery I had. I'm not going to take that medication because I don't want to be addicted. And when I'm talking to my patients and I'm trying to explain to them, like, hey, yes, like obviously getting addicted is a two-way street. It takes me, right, someone like a doctor writing the prescriptions to you. Obviously, it takes you abusing them, right? So it's a two-way street. So I don't want you to think that this is you're all alone when I write you the prescription. No, I have just as much responsibility. And that's kind of why I would have loved to see at least one physician kind of follow from the beginning to the end, and because I think that would have been a very, at least for me, the physician watching would have been a very interesting story arc to see. All right, what is that physician experiencing, like as he's going or she is going through the epidemic? Like I would have loved to see that because, and I kind of like foreshadowed it earlier. When I was a resident coming out of residency, what they did was they shut down all of the pill mills, like especially in the state of Florida. They shut them down, got them out of there. Said if you're a physician practicing like this, you are no longer practicing like this. Like so, immediately you had patients who were dependent on these ridiculous and I'm telling you, like some of the dosages that they were discussing, wow. But you had patients who were like dependent on these high dose opioid medication, OxyContin, and they couldn't get it. And they couldn't get it, so now they were either withdrawing because they couldn't get the medication they depended on, or even worse, they were stepping up and saying, hey, you know what? If I can't get the OxyContin, guess what? I'm going to go get heroin because that's in that same family. Right. So, and it's one of those things where, like, hey, if I can't get. So, you had two avenues that wasn't really a good avenue for either way. So, we would get a lot of opioid withdrawal admissions. We get a lot of opioid abuse admissions. We got a lot of those admissions as a resident, and it just like peaked up like once all of uh the rules started being enacted. Now just recently, and I'll put a link in the description, just recently the settlement that Purdue Pharma, which is the company that made OxyContin, eventually came to a settlement of about $6 billion and some legal maneuvering to try to avoid civil liability. And it was set to go, but they actually just got paused. And like I said, I'll put a link in the description, in our YouTube description. But they actually was held because there was some concern. Like, say, hey, how can they do what they did, make a boatload of money, and they made billions with a B, billions with a B, and now the families, now the cities that were decimated. Like I'm not. This is not hyperbole. There were entire cities decimated due to the opioid epidemic. So now you have these cities that are decimated from it, and they're all kind of. They had to do a clash action. Like imagine multiple states having to sue one company, multiple states. Just think about what we did, and you probably, especially depending on how old you are, you probably even know. But the way we had to go after the tobacco industry, they had to go after this one company that was making this one drug that was causing an epidemic across the whole nation. And like I said, I'm not going to get into no, I don't want to spill any details. But again, the origin of this small company and the way they got the drug out to market, and the way they got the drug into the physician's hands, and the way they did all of these different things is so just like it hurts to see it, because because you can see the exact steps and be like, yeah, I can see why. Like again, I'm watching this from a physician. I can be like, oh, I can see where that ball got dropped. Oh, I could definitely see why physician would prescribe, right? like because you have physicians getting paid to prescribe more like that. And it wasn't this is what tripped us out. Again, this is quick spoiler alert. Quick spoiler alert. If you have not watched it, press pause right now. If you haven't watched it, press pause right now. So you had doctors who were not getting paid bonuses for the number of prescriptions that they're writing. Think about that, which that would make sense. Like, hey, if I wrote 100 prescriptions versus someone else writing, 500 prescriptions, yes, the person who wrote 500 prescriptions should get paid more, right? Because they wrote for more prescriptions. No, that's not what this company was doing. This company says, hey, you know what? I'm going to give you a higher bonus on the dosages. So yes, you could have wrote for 100 prescriptions versus that person that wrote for 500. But if the person who wrote for 500 wrote for a lower dose medication, and the person who wrote for 100 wrote for higher doses of medication, the person with the higher doses of medication, aka high doses of painkillers that you were being given, with that you were unfortunately going to become addicted to, the doctor was actually getting paid more money for it. So again, it was just shocking to see, and shocking to hear, shocking to live through. Like I said, I didn't live through like the height of it, but the tail end of it, when all of the rules started getting passed down, all of the regulations, all of the new databases started becoming developed. Like that's when I came up during my career as a physician. And I could just imagine when I think back when I was probably a medical student even beforehand, like, wow, like this really used to happen this way. Like it's almost unimaginable when you think about it. But here we are. So I thought this was definitely a series, especially if you're inclined, especially medical, right? If you're medically inclined, I definitely, especially my medical students, my medical residents, like definitely a series you need to check out, because it's going to not only help benefit you, right, just for a different set of understanding, but then it'll help benefit your patients, because then when your patients say like, "Oh, I'm not gonna do this, I don't want to get addicted," then you kind of know where they're coming from. You can kind of understand like, okay, I see why the fear is here. I could see why you're concerned. Let me see if I can help answer your concerns. Like I think it's extremely important to do so, especially in this day and age where information is so available to patients around. You have to know what to say and how to say it for your patient if you want to take care of your patient the best. So again, I'm here truly Dr. Pierre again. Uh, I guess I put my movie critic hat on. I will be taking it off until the next series comes around that's kind of medically related, and you guys say, "Hey, Dr. Barry, talk about that." See you guys later, and make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. We need your support.